The chamber was silent except for the steady humming of alien machinery. The walls curved and glowed, faint blue casting shadows across the floor where the human sat chained. He was alone in the center of the room, wrists bound, ankles bolted to the ground, yet his face held no panic, no fear, no sweat, just calm eyes staring at the wall in front of him. The door slid open with a hiss and in stepped Valera, tall, cold, and cloaked in the black robes of an imperial interrogator. Her boots made no sound as she approached, but the air around her shifted with authority. She had broken warlords and assassins' minds, shattered in her grip, yet now her gaze narrowed with curiosity as she looked at the silent human. He should be trembling, she thought. This was the expected behavior: fear, confusion, desperation, perhaps tears. But none came. He looked at her, and there was a flicker of amusement in his expression. It unsettled her. She drew closer until she stood just feet away from him, her voice low and sharp like a blade against skin. She asked, "Why aren't you afraid, human?" His eyes didn't blink, didn't even twitch. He simply smiled, a slow, quiet smile that somehow made the room feel colder than it had moments before. He tilted his head slightly and said, "Afraid of what? Dying? I've seen worse than anything. You can show me." Valera froze. She wasn't sure what response she had expected, but this wasn't it. He sounded sincere, not cocky, not reckless, but like someone who had already walked through fire and decided it wasn't hot enough. She folded her arms and circled him, scanning for signs of weakness. Tremors, twitches, signs of lying, but he sat there like a statue with a pulse. She activated the pain field under his chair, a silent electric force that usually made prisoners scream within seconds. His muscles tensed for a brief moment and then relaxed again as if he had adjusted to the agony. Valera watched him. She increased the setting, and still he did not cry out. He looked at her and said, "Is that all you've got? I survived my own kind's wars. This is nothing." Her fingers tightened around her device. She turned off the field, stepped closer, leaned down, and studied his eyes. They were calm, too still. "You're bluffing," she said. "No one can endure that without training. Who are you really?" He looked up at her slowly and said, "I'm human. That's all we need to be." That answer struck something deep inside her. It wasn't what he said, but how he said it, as if being human was enough, as if it meant something more than species or biology, like it was a curse or a warning. She stepped back, and for a brief moment something flickered in her eyes, confusion, maybe fear. She remembered the stories her kind whispered, the tales dismissed as myths of humans surviving planets that no life should survive, tales of humans turning hopeless battles into victories through madness. And well, not technology, not numbers, just this terrifying ability to endure. And now one sat before her, smiling after withstanding pain meant to cripple the strongest minds. She turned away and opened a channel to her superior, requesting more information on Earth's history, on its species classification. The screen blinked red, restricted data level 13 above her clearance. Her breath caught in her throat. She had clearance to execute planetary leaders, but not access to human war records. Why? Her eyes moved to the man again. He sat in the same spot, calm, unbroken, his head tilted slightly as if he knew what she had seen. She asked, "What did your people do to earn that kind of secrecy?" He answered, "We didn't start out strong. We just never gave up. Every time something tried to end us, we adapted. We learned, we grew sharper, stronger, colder, and when that wasn't enough, we loved harder, we lost more, and we kept going." Valera felt a weight in her chest, a discomfort she had never felt in all her years of psychological control. The idea that pain made his kind stronger was absurd, unnatural, yet here it was, living, breathing, undeniable. She ended the session early and walked out of the room, but as she reached the hallway and looked back through the glass, her eyes met his again, and this time his smile had faded, replaced by something far more dangerous. Not rage, not hatred, not even defiance, just the look of someone waiting and knowing and being patient. And Valera suddenly felt like the prisoner had been her, not him, from the very beginning. That thought chased her down the corridor even as she tried to dismiss it. Something about his silence echoed louder than screams, and she couldn't shake it, not even when the door shut and locked behind her, sealing him away from view. The question still rang in her mind. Why wasn't he afraid, and what did it mean that he truly wasn't? Valera stood in front of the mirror inside her private quarters. Her face calm, but her thoughts storming. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her neural link and requested access again to human records. Again the system denied her clearance level restricted. Again the red warning flashed and her heart skipped a beat. This was not protocol. No species was hidden this deeply, even the war beasts of Harkesh, even the extinct burners of Tovex had their histories fully available, but not human. She paced the room, remembering the human's words, his calm voice, the quiet power behind them. There was no threat in his tone, but somehow it had shaken her more than any weapon ever had. She couldn't forget the way he said, "We loved harder, we lost more," like loss itself had made them fierce, not broken. She had never considered loss as fuel, only as weakness, but this human had spoken of it like a blade his kind had learned to sharpen over centuries. She sat at her console and called the head xenopsychologist. He appeared on screen, tired and annoyed. She told him everything about the interrogation, how the human had not flinched, how the pain field failed, how the emotional scan showed no instability, only cold, calm stillness. The xenopsychologist stared at her for a moment, then asked, "What exactly did he say?" She repeated it word for word, and the man on screen grew pale. Slowly, silently, he leaned forward and said, "Do not go back in there alone." Valera blinked, confused. "What are you talking about? He's unarmed, restrained." But the man shook his head. "You don't understand. They're not like us. We break things when we fear. They become unbreakable when they fear. And right now he knows you're afraid of him." She ended the call without replying. Her pride wouldn't let her retreat, not yet, not from a creature still chained. So she returned to the cell, walked in and stared at the human who had not moved, not blinked, not shifted. He said, "You came back." She said, "I want answers, and I want the truth." He said, "I already told you the truth, you just don't want to believe it." She stepped closer, stood before him, and asked, "What do you mean? Humans fear too, don't they?" He nodded. "Of course we do, but we never let it rule us. We turn fear into fire and walk through it. Well, it burns us." She frowned. "That's poetic, but not scientific. Fear disables the mind, shuts down logic, reduces survival chances." He smiled again, that unsettling, slow smile, and said, "Only if you let it control you. We control it. That's the difference." She stared into his eyes, and suddenly the silence between them grew heavier than before. It pressed down on her shoulders like invisible weight. She activated a vision stream to test his subconscious. She wanted to see what memories would surface, what nightmares he might try to hide, but what flooded the screen made her breath hitch. Images of children running through rubble, carrying wounded mothers, humans charging into battles, outnumbered 10-to-1, men and women singing songs in burning villages, old soldiers smiling while patching up younger ones, even as shells screamed. Overhead there was pain, yes, oceans of it, but also laughter and determination and something worse for Valera to understand: acceptance of death, not avoidance, not denial, but partnership, as if humans had made peace with death long ago and danced with it instead of hiding from it. She ended the stream abruptly, her chest tightening. She felt like she had been dragged through emotional fire, just watching, and yet the human still sat still, breathing calm, like it was all normal for him. She asked, "Why show me that? Why let me see those things?" He replied, "Because you asked. What makes us human, that is what we are. We don't run from suffering, we carry it. We don't avoid fear, we hold it close until it burns into strength." Valera turned her back to him, walked in circles, trying to make sense of what she felt. Her hands shaking. Her training told her to remain composed, but her instincts screamed that this was something new, something not covered in any manual. She looked at him again and said, "Then what do you want here? Why let yourself be captured?" He said, "Maybe I wanted to see how far your kind would go. Maybe I wanted to understand the ones who fear us most." Valera's eyes narrowed. "You think we fear you?" He said, "I think you do, but you don't understand why yet, and that makes it worse for you. You fear what cannot be controlled, and we can't be controlled, not by you, not by your empire, and that's what chills your bones." Valera felt her blood turn cold. She hated How true his words felt, she turned sharply and walked out of the room, but this time, it wasn't strategy. It was retreat, and the human watched her leave, not with anger, not with triumph, just with the same unshaken gaze of someone who had already seen the worst the galaxy could throw and survived it. Valera did not sleep that cycle. Her mind replayed the memories she had pulled from the human's mind over and over again. She sat alone in the dark observation deck looking at the stars and wondering how a species born from one single planet could endure such chaos and still remain whole. She thought back to the burning villages, the blood and fire and music, the defiance in the face of extinction, the hands that pulled others from rubble even when their own legs were broken. It did not make sense. It defied all she had learned about psychology, biology, and warfare. The human was not trained in mental resistance, yet he resisted all her methods without resistance at all, not by force, but by stillness, by presence, by something deeper. Valera opened her files and began searching for incidents where humans had fought impossible odds. The system refused her requests for classified battles again and again, denied, until finally she used a covert channel designed for internal rebellions. She typed in one word, Earth, and the data began to flow, slowly fragmented, but enough. She read about a siege where 5 humans held a mining station for 6 days against an entire armored division. She read about explorers who chose to detonate their own escape ships to destroy alien viruses, sacrificing themselves with full awareness and resolve. She read about mothers who shielded their children from collapsing buildings, about prisoners who passed secret messages using rhythm and blinking eyes, refusing to surrender even while dying. The pattern was clear. Humans did not simply survive, they adapted, they absorbed pain and carried it forward, not as burden but as fuel and phasmal. Something about that made her chest feel heavy. She did not recognize the emotion. It was not fear, not anger, something else, like a deep unspoken respect laced with dread. Valera entered the chamber again, this time with no guards, no weapons, just her and the human who had still not moved much. He looked up at her and said, "Did you sleep?" She shook her head and replied, "I saw your people. I saw what you come from. I do not understand how you exist." He leaned back as much as his bindings allowed and said, "Most of the galaxy does not understand us. We barely understand ourselves." She asked, "What makes your kind choose to fight when running is safer?" He said, "We do run sometimes, but only to regroup, only to protect, not to hide. We fight because we remember every hand that pulled us up, every voice that told us to keep going. We carry those with us even when they're gone." Valera was silent for a long moment, then asked, "And the ones you lost, the ones you could not save?" He looked away just for a breath and said, "We grieve them, but we do not let their sacrifice fade. We honor them by standing even when it hurts, even when we bleed, because they stood once for us." She felt something crack inside her, a tiny fracture in her carefully built wall. She thought of her own people who taught suppression over expression, who erased emotion from training, who removed the weak and elevated the unfeeling. But this human spoke of pain as legacy, not as failure, and something in that idea stirred a fear inside her deeper than any pain field or plasma weapon. She stepped closer and said, "You are dangerous not because of what you do, but because of what you are." He nodded and said, "Now you understand, and that is why I am not afraid." She whispered, "Then what do I do with you if I cannot break you?" He answered, "Perhaps you must let me break you, not with violence, not with power, but with truth." She stared at him as if seeing him for the first time, not as a prisoner, but as a mirror reflecting a flaw in her own species, something they had tried to erase, something they feared feeling, and she turned away because it hurt to feel it. She exited the room once more, but this time she did not slam the door or call for backup or file a report. She walked slowly, her steps echoing and her eyes wide, because for the first time in her life she was beginning to understand that maybe strength was not in control but in chaos, not in silence but in sorrow, not in fearlessness but in surviving fear and rising with it. Valera entered the chamber earlier than usual, her steps quiet, her hands empty. The guards at the door looked confused but said nothing. She dismissed them without speaking, and they obeyed, though their eyes lingered on the human chained in the center of the room. Valera walked around him, not saying anything. Her mind was loud. Though thoughts screaming at each other, none winning, silence filled the space except for the subtle breath of the man before her. He tilted his head without looking at her and said, "You are different today." Her voice came slowly, as if it had to travel through something thick inside her, and she replied, "I had questions now. I have only echoes." He turned to face her, his eyes not cruel, not smug, just aware. And he said, "Then sit not as prisoner and captor, but as two minds caught in the same storm." She hesitated, then did something she had never done. She sat on the floor across from him, crossing her legs, ignoring protocol and rank. She looked at him and said, "I used to believe pain made us weak," he said. And now she said, "I think denying pain makes us weaker." Nodded once and silence returned, but it was softer now, like a blanket, not a blade. She looked at the restraints around his wrists, metal bands scorched from earlier attempts to escape, but still locked. Still holding, she reached forward without thinking and deactivated the clamps. His hands fell to his lap, and for a moment they both simply breathed. She said, "Do you not plan to run?" He said, "Why would I run when I have not finished speaking?" She leaned back against the wall and stared up at the ceiling lights, pale and pulsing like heartbeat, and she asked, "How do you keep your mind clear when the world tries to poison it?" He said, "We do not always keep it clear. Sometimes we fall, sometimes we break, but when we do, we reach out to the ones still standing. We lift each other, even if all we have left are broken hands." She turned her gaze to him and asked, "What if you are alone?" He said, "Then we remember the ones who stood before us and pretend they are still near until we can stand again." Her breath caught at the simplicity of it, and yet it felt heavier than any book she had studied. Her people deleted records of failure, erased all signs of breakdown, labeled weakness as threat, but this man spoke of weakness as the foundation of strength. She asked, "When you were captured, why did you not resist more?" He said, "Because I knew the bars you placed on me were not as strong as the bars inside your own minds." She flinched slightly at the truth of it, and then asked what would happen if more of you came. He looked at her carefully, then said, "We do not come to conquer, but we will never kneel. We do not start wars, but we do not stop defending, even when we are the last breath left." Valera stood slowly, unsure of her balance, like the ground had shifted beneath her, and said, "I fear what this truth may do to my people." He replied, "Truth only destroys what was built on lies." She turned toward the door, but paused, then faced him again and asked, "Why me? Why speak to me like this? Why let me see?" He said, "Because I saw in your eyes a crack, not weakness, but potential to see, not just look, to feel, not just react." She nodded slowly and left without another word. The door slid shut and the guards returned, but they did not question her. Not that time later, that cycle, when the system ran its checks on security, it showed an anomaly the human had removed his restraints, without tools, without force, simply waiting and watching, knowing the system would be weakened at the right moment. But he had not left. He had not run. He sat calmly, hands free, head bowed as if in meditation or mourning, and the guards refused to enter until higher command ordered them to. And still the human did nothing, just sat there waiting again. And when Valera returned and saw the image, her knees nearly gave out, because she understood that control had never been hers. Not truly, the human had stayed not from weakness but from choice, and that made him more dangerous than anything she had ever known, and also more familiar than anything she had ever feared. The ship began to change in ways no one could explain. The lights flickered more often, the crew moved with growing tension, and the usual discipline of the Imperial fleet started to crack. Valera noticed how the soldiers avoided looking at the prisoner when they passed his chamber, how the science officers requested transfers without reason, how even the security team began whispering about dreams, strange, vivid dreams, filled with fire voices and distant screams. Valera tried to shut down the rumors, but the unease spread faster than orders. She sat in the observation bay again, watching stars drift in silence, and thought about the human who had not touched a weapon. Not made a threat yet had brought the strongest vessel in the fleet to the edge of psychological collapse. He remained calm, unmoving, eyes sharp. Every time she saw him, it felt like he was seeing something she could not, a thread unwinding, a truth waiting to be spoken. She entered his chamber again, and this time the lights above dimmed slightly, as if the ship itself recoiled from what might happen. She walked toward him and stopped just beyond arm's reach. She said, "The crew fears you." He replied, "They fear what they cannot name." "Not me," she said. "They dream of you. They hear your voice even when you sleep." He said, "Perhaps they are remembering something buried deep, something your kind forgot long ago." She stepped closer and said, "I need to understand, what is it about you that tears down order?" Without lifting a hand, he looked at her, then slowly said, "Fear is not our enemy. Silence is not our strength. Pain is not our end. We have learned to turn every wound into a step forward, and those who fear change feel us coming long before we arrive." Valera felt the air thicken around them. Her own heart beat faster, and her voice cracked slightly when she said, "Are you a weapon sent to weaken us from within?" He smiled and said, "No, I am a mirror, and mirrors do not destroy. They only reveal." She stepped back and tried to process the growing pressure in her chest, not from fear, but from recognition. She remembered the faces of the crew lately, how their expressions shifted, how they spoke more of home, of old memories, of people they lost, and it hit her. The human was not spreading fear, he was awakening it. But not to control, rather to confront, to face it instead of running from it. That was what made him dangerous. He didn't bring chaos, he brought reflection, and in a society built on suppression, reflection was poison. Later that cycle, an officer broke protocol and attacked the prisoner. He entered the chamber without approval, triggered the stun field to maximum, and aimed a pulse rifle at the human. The footage showed something no one expected. The human stood calmly, walked forward through the field, and took the weapon without struggle, not with speed, not with strength, just with stillness. The officer dropped to his knees, sobbing, not from pain, but from something deeper, and the human did not move further, just sat down again and placed the weapon at his own feet. Valera reviewed the footage a dozen times. There was no aggression, no defense, only presence. She summoned the officer later and asked, "What did you see? What broke you?" The man stared at nothing and whispered, "He didn't fight because he knew I would break myself. He knew I wasn't angry at him. I was angry at the silence inside me." Valera dismissed him and went to the human again. This time she stood at the door and asked, "Have you done this before?" He replied, "Not with intent, but it happens when we are forced to stand still and others begin to move." She asked, "What will happen if I release you?" He said, "Nothing. I will walk, I will breathe, I will leave, and the echoes will remain." She asked, "And if I kill you?" He said, "Then you will still hear me in every quiet moment, and you will never forget that once something sat here unarmed and unafraid and still won." Valera felt a chill move through her spine, not from power, not from threat, but from truth, a truth too heavy to ignore, too loud to silence, and she knew then that no weapon, no law, no fear could cage what he was not, because he was inhuman, but because he was human, and that made him more than any system could contain. The ship was no longer quiet, it groaned from within as if the walls themselves had begun to reject their purpose. The crew walked like shadows, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting something to crawl out of the corners. Even the command officers, who once barked orders, now whispered behind closed doors. Valera watched all of this from the command deck, her hands clenched behind her back, her eyes fixed on the starfield, but her mind was somewhere else, deep within the cell, where the human sat unmoved, untouched, unchanged. She had studied countless species, learned the languages of fear across 100 systems, but nothing prepared her for the way silence could speak, the way stillness could dismantle the very bones of a machine built to dominate. She descended the lower decks and past crew who stepped aside without speaking, not out of respect, but out of silent warning. They knew where she was going, they feared it, and perhaps they feared her for daring to go there again. She entered the cell once more, and this time the human looked older, not by age, not by wear, but by weight, as if time had gathered around him. And he carried it all without complaint. He looked at her and said, "The ship is cracking, you feel it." She nodded slowly, not in denial, not in confusion, but in tired agreement. She said, "It is not from the outside. There is no breach, no sabotage yet. The systems fail, the hearts fail, the minds unravel, and I cannot stop it," he said, "because it was never built to hold the truth, only to hide from it. And truth does not stay buried. It claws its way through the silence until it screams." She walked to him and sat not across from him this time, but beside him, shoulder to shoulder, and said, "We trained to erase pain, to avoid it, but now it follows us because we never faced it." He said, "Every step you took away from it only made it grow, and now you are standing in its shadow." She asked, "Is that why you came here, to bring this upon us?" He shook his head and said, "I came to survive. I stayed to witness what happens when a house built on fear meets a voice that does not tremble." She looked at him and said, "They want me to end this. They say you are the infection." He said, "I am only the reflection. I gave you nothing you did not already carry." She turned her head slowly and whispered, "They fear me now, not because I failed to break you, but because I did not try harder, and because I listened." He looked at her then and said, "What you hear cannot be unheard. What you feel now is the beginning of choice, and that is what your kind never wanted you to have." She asked, "Then what should I do?" Now he said, "Look at the stars, then look inside yourself, then choose whether to close your eyes or open theirs." She stood again, the weight of the decision heavy, not because it was forced, but because it was hers and hers alone. Later that cycle, the lights in the prisoner cell dimmed to black, the door unsealed and remained open. And yet the human did not move, not to flee, not to fight. He simply sat waiting, because he knew if freedom must be taken, it is not true freedom, and if freedom is offered, then the one who offers it must also carry what comes after. Valera stood outside that door watching him, and behind her the crew gathered, not by command but by instinct, drawn to the silence and the truth it held, and none of them spoke. They just waited to see what would happen next. And when the human finally stood and walked through the open door past Valera, past the crew, past the stares and questions, he said nothing. And they parted, not out of fear, but out of understanding. And somewhere deep in the ship, the systems began to stabilize. The lights brightened slightly, and a long breath seemed to move through the corridors, as if something unseen had passed and left behind. Something heavier than steel, but lighter than chains. Valera remained still, her eyes locked on the place where he had walked, and her voice low as she whispered, "Not infection, not invasion, not madness, only reflection and choice." The corridor was silent after he passed through it, but the silence was no longer filled with fear. It held something deeper, something unspoken. The crew watched him walk without resistance, without weapons. His hands open, his steps steady, like he had already walked this path long before it existed. The alarms did not sound, the doors did not lock. The systems that once monitored him no longer responded, because they no longer knew how to define him. He was not a threat. He was not an ally. He was something beyond their classifications, a presence that reshaped the space around him without touching a single panel. Valera followed at a distance, not by command, but by will. Something inside her refused to let him leave her sight. She felt the shift in the air, felt the change in her own pulse, and with each step she understood more of what he had said. The Empire had built its rule on fear, on silence, on the suppression of feeling, but this one human with no army, no tech, no armor, had unraveled that illusion by simply refusing to fear them. He had not fought their weapons. He had fought their certainty, and he had won. The human paused at the airlock, the outer doors leading to the observation platform, a place where stars could be seen without filters, where the ship was most vulnerable. He turned and looked back, and for a moment his eyes met Valera's again. She stepped forward slowly, unsure what she would say or do, and he spoke before she could find the words. "Your people are not weak. They are not broken. They are just lost in a world that told them not to feel, and now they do, and they do not know what to do with it," she said, "and you do." He nodded, "Not because it is easy, but because we have been there before. Every time our world collapsed, we felt it fully. We screamed, we wept, we held on to each other. And we rose again, not despite the pain, but because of it." She said, "And now what do you want from us?" He said, "Nothing. What happens next is not mine to decide. You have seen the truth, and truth demands its own path. Whether you walk it or not is your choice." She looked around at the crew behind her, at the officers who had once followed her orders without question. Now standing still, silent, listening to every word he spoke, she turned back and said, "They will not understand right away," he said. "They are not meant to change overnight. They are meant to begin, and beginnings are always slow, always painful, but they are also real." She asked, "Will I see you again?" He said, "Only if you choose to look where others choose to turn away, only if you listen when others choose to be silent, only if you feel when others beg you to numb it." She stepped back, slowly letting him pass through the outer door onto the platform, and for a moment he stood beneath the stars, surrounded by nothing, and yet more present than anyone she had ever known. The stars reflected in his eyes, and she realized then that fear had never ruled him. Not because he lacked it, but because he had made peace with it. The door closed gently behind him, not locked, not sealed. Just closed, and the crew stood still for many moments. No one spoke, no one moved, until Valera finally turned and said the words that none of them expected him to say. "Change nothing and everything. We are still who we were, but now we know what we could be, and that is what terrifies us the most and inspires us the most." From that day the ship moved differently. The reports changed, the chain of command loosened, and voices, once buried in protocol, began to rise, quiet at first, then stronger. They did not abandon their mission, but they no longer followed it blindly. They questioned, they reflected, they remembered, and Valera kept one chair empty on the bridge, a silent reminder of the man who had walked among them without chains, without violence, and left behind something far heavier than war. He had left a mirror and the courage to finally look into it. Human walked alone into the stars, his steps light as if gravity no longer mattered. The observation platform wrapped around him, vast and open and endless. The stars did not flicker, they burned steady and fierce. Like the fire that lived inside him, he looked out into the void, but he did not see emptiness. He saw paths, futures, memories of those who carried pain like banners and turned scars into stories. Behind him the ship was silent, yet alive, no longer trembling from fear, but pulsing with something raw and honest. The crew had not followed him, yet they all felt the pull of his presence, even in absence. Valera stood near the inner glass, not speaking, not moving, just watching as the figure grew smaller until he vanished into the horizon of stars. She remembered every word, every breath he had spoken, remembered how he never demanded anything, yet left everything changed. His strength was not in muscles or machines, but in truth and the way he stood unbroken, while others bent in the way he reflected them back at themselves and made them choose whether to look or turn away. And now as she stood alone, she did not feel despair. She felt something new rising from the silence. Not command, not obedience, but understanding. She turned from the glass and walked through the corridors, where crew members looked up not for orders but for guidance, and she gave none. Only a glance that said, "You must decide," and they understood because he had already spoken and left his voice in their bones. The ship changed course not by programming, but by choice. They did not run from their fear. They faced it, walked through it, carried it together, because one unarmed human sat still and refused to be broken, and in doing so he taught them how to begin again. The end.